First, note that we have simultaneous interpretation. So to hear interpretation into English, please click on the globe at on the bottom right and then click on English to hear the interpretation. If you don't see the globe, click on the 3 dots and then language interpretation, then English. If you have any trouble using the interpretation, let us know in the chat. We're going to have a Q&A section, so please list your questions in the Q&A section in the chat. And finally, the webinar will be recorded and will be posted later. Thank you for joining us again. With the recent election behind us, the U.S. is clearly poised for another shift in its approach to migration across the Americas. Over the past few years, the Biden-Harris administration implemented measures like the Los Angeles Declaration on Migration and Protection that was signed by more than 20 countries at the Summit of the Americas in 2022, and that contains several commitments related to international protection, humane migration management, and a coordinated and shared response to migration management. The administration also started different initiatives, such as the Safe Mobility Offices, and also expanded alternative migration pathways. These positive policies have been paired with strong border controls through different measures, including bilateral agreements with countries like Panama that move the U.S. border further south in the region. And it is clear that migration in the Americas continues to grow both in scale and complexity, and it's fueled by different factors: economic, political, environmental, security. And migration has become central to policy discussion in the hemisphere, with virtually all countries in the region now participating in migration cycles, whether as countries of origin, transit, destination, or return. The United States remains the primary destination, though South American countries, especially looking at Colombia and Peru, have attracted significant number of migrants, particularly from Venezuela. And in fact, the number of migrants residing in the region nearly doubled from 8.3 million in 2010 to over 16 million in 2022. So we're looking to have a very productive discussion today, where we aim to look beyond the U.S.-Mexico border and talk about regional implications of recent U.S. policies and how they have shaped migration management in the Americas. Also, we will look to expected policy shifts under the new administration in the U.S. and the potential impacts that this is going to have in the region. And we're going to explore pathways forward that support both humane and effective migration governance across the region and potential implications for those. Today, we have a great group of panelists. We have Francisca Vigaud-Walsh. She's a director of strategy and advocacy at the Center for Engagement and Advocacy in the Americas. Jael Scheicher, she's the director for the Americas and Europe Refugees International. Rachel Smith, she's a senior advocate for Latin America at Refugees International. Hannah Flam, deputy director for policy at IRAP, and Eric Crew, staff attorney at Haitian Bridge Alliance. And so I want to start with a couple of questions. The region is facing several overlapping displacement situations in Colombia, Venezuela, in Central America, Mexico, Nicaragua, and Haiti. And these complex and large scale movements reflect a confluence of urgent challenges that require both immediate action and also sustainable and coordinated solutions. And as I said, under the Biden administration, we saw efforts to expand pathways for refugee resettlement, including initiatives like the Welcome Courts for private sponsorship. Now, with the recent shift in U.S. leadership, key questions arise about the future of the programs. And so I wanted to start with the first questions. What policy reversals or what restrictions are likely under this new Trump administration, and how might these changes impact the number of refugees admitted? If we could start with you, Hannah, that would be great.
Of course. Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. Trump has expressed the intention to indefinitely curtail refugee admissions. So to unpack what that policy agenda looks like, I want to look at what refugee processing is in general, how it operates, and then secondly, talk about what the rules are versus what the process is in practice. So what leverage they have to drastically cut refugee processing quickly. And then if there's a couple minutes, I'll speak to what people who are currently in refugee processing can expect to happen to their case. Refugee processing is mostly an executive branch discretionary program. So this is worldwide, US government officials determining that somebody classifies as a refugee and can arrive to the United States as a refugee, as opposed to asylum, where you're seeking the same type of protection, but from the territorial United States. And it's executive in the sense that the president, consulting with Congress, can determine both the programs that admit people as refugees and also the regional caps on how many people can be admitted. There's a couple dimensions of the U.S. refugee admissions program that is established by Congress and therefore would require legislative action to change. And that may happen as well, but it will not be immediate. But many of you may have heard of the Safe Mobility Initiative in Latin America and the Caribbean, or the Central American Minors Refugee and Parole Program. These are both vehicles to access the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, and those vehicles to access can be dismantled quite easily, including for people who are in that pipeline already. When I referenced earlier the difference between the rules and caps governing refugee processing versus the practical implementation and processing itself, what I was alluding to is while President-elect Trump and potentially the Republican-controlled Congress are advancing an agenda to, through regulation, through executive and legislative action, terminate most access to refugee resettlement. At the same time, the bureaucracy that typically processes refugee applications can effectively be stalled. And so I think what we're anticipating and what happened last time is both of those tools operating in tandem. So the president has the authority to issue a new presidential determination on refugee admissions to drastically cut the number of people who are allowed to be resettled. And in the meantime, all of the steps, security vetting, family relationship verification, interviews, all of those steps can basically be stalled out so that in the interim, people stop arriving as well.
Thank you, Hannah. And thinking about other programs that might also impact this, like with the potential revocation of CBP-1, the parole programs, and TPS for countries like Haiti, what consequences might arise for immigrants waiting to seek asylum at the border or who lose their protections and ability to work in the U.S.? And what are the expected impacts of increased deportations on both sending countries, but also the remittance flows? I'll go to Yael and Hannah.
Thanks so much, and thanks for being here. So just so that we understand where we are now and what the Biden administration has done, the Biden administration has put in place several legal pathways for controlling access to U.S. territory, and these have affected hundreds of thousands of people already. So already now, under the asylum rules in place at the border, people who cross between ports of entry without using these legal pathways are mostly ineligible for asylum. They have difficulty getting protection screenings at higher standards and are subject to fast deportation. But one of the legal pathways that is in place is this CBP-1 appointment system. And when I was in Mexico in September, I met some of the almost 1 million people that the Mexican government has been busing around south, and A lot of them, some of them were coming north, into Mexico, and they're in southern Mexico, like at the Guatemalan border. Some of them are waiting in Mexico City. All are waiting for these CBP1 appointments. And Mexico only lets people move north if they have these appointments assured. And it provides actually a few buses from the south now to bring people with those appointments north. But everybody else who tries to move, and even some people with appointments who try to move, are subject to enforcement by Mexican authorities and kidnapping, extortion, and worse, by criminal groups if they try to move north to the US border. But all of these people are waiting for appointments in Mexico to use this app. I cannot express how the growth and significance of this application has grown in Mexico over the last year. And these appointments, Trump has sort of promised to basically cancel. Like CBP1 will be canceled as soon as he comes into office. So, I mean, one thing that we could do, or we could see the Biden administration, if it wants to sort of help manage this flow in the lame duck period, it would be a good idea to increase the number of admissions through CBP1 appointments at the border and to maybe work with Mexico to get more buses up to the north. Otherwise, what's going to happen at the beginning of the Trump administration is just like a lot of people stuck without anything, all of these people. I should say that this electronic metering system, basically what CBP1 is going to go away. And there was a recent ruling in an appeals court in California that basically said that the US government can't really turn people away at ports of entry, but gave the US government, this is the Biden administration, but it will continue in the Trump administration, sort of wide latitude to carry out a waitlist system at the border. So we could see during the Trump administration a sort of another version of metering at ports of entry, not using CBP1, but something else. And I should say that there is still a sort of regulation on the books left over from the end of the last Trump administration that would allow sort of like a kind of Title 42-like authority for sort of rapid expulsion of people coming to the border. And the Biden administration, it would help if they revoked and rescinded that regulation so the Trump administration didn't have it as a tool to use as soon as it came in. The last thing I wanted to talk about is...
Sorry to interrupt. I'm seeing in the chat the interpreters are asking you to speak a little more slowly. Thank you so much.
That's a problem I have. Thank you. I will. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela parole processes, which is another legal pathway that the Biden administration created to allow about 30,000 people of those four nationalities per month to come to the United States if they have sponsors, and they come through U.S. airports. They fly in through that program. In making that agreement, Mexico, in sort of setting up these parole processes, Mexico also agreed to accept the return of the same number of people of those nationalities who cross between ports of entry rather than come and use the airports. So Trump has vowed to end this program as well. And so what that will mean is that for applicants for the program who are waiting for approval to travel, or even for those who've been granted travel authorization but who haven't yet come to the United States, and this includes a lot of family members of people who have come previously through this program. I just wanted to make that point. Once the parole programs are terminated, those people who are waiting will not be able to be paroled into the United States. In general, there may be some exceptions because parole is case by case, but in general, there won't be a program available. And people who are already in the United States with parole could lose that status and their authority to work. Terminating parole places people in sort of the status of almost like being applicants for admission, and they are removable. If parolees apply or have applied for other statuses to which they're eligible, so for example, TPS or adjustment of status to a visa or asylum, they may have an alternative legal status available to them and the legal authority to work through that status. During the lame duck, the Biden administration could prioritize those applications for these other statuses and the work authorization applications to give people a little bit extra protection. How easy will it be for the Trump administration to sort of end the TPS programs that some of these, which is one of the alternative statuses that parolees could apply for, or actually remove the parolees from the country? This will probably be litigated in the courts. Litigation over TPS happened throughout the first Trump administration when Trump tried to terminate TPS for Haiti, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua, among other countries. And it may delay things again during the second Trump administration. There hasn't ever been an attempt to remove tens of thousands of people formerly paroled into the country. The economic impact of ending TPS or of rounding up and deporting all of these formerly people in legal status in the United States is immense. Those living in states with local authorities who will work with the Trump administration might be easier to find, but many will still need to go through removal proceedings in immigration court. The Trump administration, I think, will mostly try to starve people out by taking away their ability to work in the United States and certainly to send remittances home. I want to just say one other thing about removals. One thing is that the Biden administration could do is try to designate and redesignate country. I'm sorry, that the Biden administration could do during the lame duck period is sort of designate and redesignate countries for TPS. Many of the countries, many countries in Latin America, Central America have TPS that's about to expire. El Salvador in early 2025, Venezuela in April of 2025, Honduras and Nicaragua in July of 2025. So the Biden administration could extend and redesignate TPS for these countries and delay their expiration dates. A redesignation of Nicaragua would give those who came in through the CHMV program about 100,000 people an added layer of protection. Only about half of the Venezuelans who have come in through the parole program are eligible for the prior TPS designation for Venezuela. So these are very important. One last thing, I know I'm over time, is that there are limits on removals. How many people will Mexico agree to take back if there's no legal pathways in the other direction, like was established, which seems to be is an interesting question. Will Mexico agree to take back third country nationals in certain numbers, maybe to damper a tariff threat by the Trump administration, or in exchange for limiting the number of returns of Mexican nationals? These are like live questions. President Sheinbaum has a lot of cards. Insisting on the human rights of migrants might not rise to the top of the cards that she'll play. But she has, I think, maybe to stave off tariff threats by the US, she might be willing to ramp up the use of the military to prevent migration over the southern border with Guatemala. That was done in the previous administration by López Obrador, when the Trump administration threatened tariffs. And especially because the Trump administration is now threatening to consider Mexican drug cartels as sort of enemy combatants, so that it would justify, U.S. invasion of Mexico or something like this. So just putting pressure on Mexico to do more enforcement with their military is something we might see.
Thanks, Yael. Hannah, would you like to add things?
Sure. Yeah, just 2 points to complement Yael's. First, we anticipate that the Trump administration, in concert with Congress, will legislate to change the definition of parole and to limit the parole authority quite beyond recognition right now. And so when Yael speaks to the first time around, the challenges to the Trump administration's attempts to terminate various parole programs, if the law changes, it may not be illegal to terminate those programs. So there's a really significant risk there that the legal authority to issue parole will change under the next administration. And then the second point I wanted to add to complement is the expectation that the Trump administration will leverage foreign policy and visa sanctions, in particular in the Western Hemisphere, in three ways. First, countries whose nationals overstay their visas in the United States, those countries will not be able to access any lawful pathway, humanitarian or family-based, labor-based, or otherwise. Secondly, countries that refuse to accept deportees of their nationals will also suffer this type of visa sanction for all types of immigration processes as a way to pressure countries to accept deportations at scale. And thirdly, anytime the future Secretary of Homeland Security declares a mass migration event of a certain nationality that is on the move, that country also will become ineligible for any immigration pathway. This, of course, I don't know what will happen, but this is among their plans.
Thanks so much, both of you. I would like to expand a little bit more on the impacts in the region of domestic enforcement and what could be the implications for those countries that will likely receive, but also with this increased enforcement that you all are speaking about, how might civil society organizations and NGOs, especially those that are providing legal and social support, be impacted? I'm going to pass it to Rachel and Eric.
Thanks, Maria Jose. So yeah, the impacts of deportations can have really serious impacts on individuals, communities, and economies, particularly if the Trump administration follows through on this promise of mass or large-scale deportation. So if we look at remittances, particularly with countries that have, large diaspora populations in the United States, they're economically and socially very intertwined. Guatemala receives about 19% of its GDP from remittances. Mexico received $23 billion in remittances just in 2023. And so many people in countries of origin rely on remittances for things like housing, schooling, healthcare. In our own research at RI, we found in Guatemala that remittances helped many local communities recover from, really devastating effects of the hurricanes, and in some cases actually prevented outmigration. So we really can expect, if there are large numbers of people return to these countries, the economies in the region could greatly be affected if those remittances are drastically reduced. I think apart from that, for countries that are receiving large numbers of deportees, it can be hard on the communities of reception. So, one study found that formal wages actually decreased in El Salvador in municipalities that received large numbers of deportees in short periods of time. We also did research that found that, people returned to countries in Central America face real stigma upon return, and in some cases, actually threats of harm or protection risks. And for countries that in Northern Central America, for example, that have kind of a longer history of receiving returnees, deportees, they have reception and reintegration programs. But what we have found in our research is that the focus tends to be more on the actual reception part, not reintegration. Reintegration is really hard. So it's very difficult for people who've been returned or deported to sort of transfer skills that they've acquired in the US, to find formal work or education. And in a lot of cases, culturally, they are very American. Many of them grew up in this country and are very devastated to leave the only country that they've called home. And so it's very common for people to end up emigrating, remigrating again within months of their return. And then, of course, there's countries that maybe have less experience in receiving and reintegrating return migrants. And so programs oriented towards those populations are virtually non-existent or not very well funded, or they just don't have the experience of this types of programming. So that could be very concerning for other populations. And I think on the NGO question, for those who are providing assistance, there could be a great impact. If we look at some of the language in Project 2025. It does state that, you know, localization will be a priority, but really only for organizations that fit within kind of a very narrow scope of eligibility. So, you know, organizations that maybe work, who are faith-based, who comply with certain types of limitations, like the global gag rule, the Mexico City policy, who maybe don't have DEI or climate focus, they may have opportunities to continue operating with support from the United States. But a lot of rights-based orgs, those who do have a DEI focus, those that mention climate change, rights for LGBTQ plus people, will likely not be eligible for foreign assistance. I think additionally, my just last point is that there's this new sort of, it's very unclear what it is, but this Department of Government Efficiency could be used to investigate NGOs who, quote unquote, you know, go against American interests. So, you know, providing legal support to migrant, cash-based support to migrant, et cetera, could be seen as potentially threatening to this new administration. And as American interests are being pretty radically redefined, or could be radically redefined in the next 4 years, this could mean consequences for NGOs beyond just funding being slashed. So thanks.
Thanks, Rachel. Eric?
Thank you, Maria Jose, and thanks, Rachel. Thanks too to Refugees International for having Haitian Bridge Alliance on, and to everyone here who's joined the webinar. I mean, this question is very near and dear to my heart. Haitian Bridge Alliance is a small grassroots nonprofit based on the US-Mexico border. We work on behalf of Black migrants, women and girls, survivors of torture, LGBTQ+ community. So we're defending the exact folks that Rachel mentioned this next administration is not going to be interested in supporting. But worse than that, I mean, we overtly took on this administration and their racist and xenophobic rhetoric towards Haitians in Springfield, Ohio. And, you know, we have experienced a huge wave of hate speech, harassment, intimidation from non-state actors. And I think we can see that, and also from actual state actors, we can see this ramp up in the US, but also across the region. So I see that as a main effect. There's going to be an increased repression of human rights defenders from state and non-state actors. Civil society organizations are going to have the internal pressures increase in terms of resource allocation, in terms of having to adapt to all these new policies and figuring out how to serve the people they're trying to serve. That's just going to impact all of the secondary trauma, difficult mental health needs, you know, of doing our work. And then last, I think there also, though, will be a greater need for cross-border collaboration between civil society in order to protect each other, and also within borders. So that is hopefully something that I see will develop, but that's also up to us as a group. And, you know, I just want to say I had the fortune before working with Haitian Bridge Alliance to work with the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti, and the real fortune of working just for a short time with the Bureau des Avocats Internationaux in Port-au-Prince, one of, you know, I think one of the best human rights defenders, movement lawyering law shops that exists in the Americas. And, you know, Haiti has been dealing with the US supporting the repression of civil society for centuries. But then, you know, as that's endured through the Biden administration, through the Trump administration, the first one, it's a continuing thing that, you know, many in the Americas are familiar with. I actually think that more in the United States, like Haitian Bridge Alliance, are going to be experiencing similar things that Haitian civil society, for example, has been experiencing for a long time. Again, I hope that what we lean into from this as a civil society community is building our power together to defend ourselves together.
Thanks, Eric. And I want to follow on with another question that it's related on, you know, the externalization trends, the border externalization trends that we're seeing. We saw the policies under the first Trump administration, such as requiring migrants to seek asylum in third countries before reaching the US. And under the current administration, although they eliminated the asylum cooperative agreements, the ACAs, the administration has also implemented similar policies, such as the circumvention of lawful pathways rule, right? And so under a second Trump administration, should we expect a ramp up of these externalization policies, particularly thinking about agreements with countries like Panama? Could we see stricter demands for regional asylum cooperation, reduced humanitarian exceptions, or even potential restrictions on legal pathways for asylum seekers?
Yes, that is exactly what we can expect to see. The U.S. externalization strategy did not start under Trump. It's a long-standing U.S. strategy dating at least back to it beginning maritime interdictions of Haitians and Cubans in the early 1980s. The goal there, and what we saw in this campaign, there was a group of people, Black and brown, who were showing up at the U.S. border, and the U.S. political system wanted to reject that. And they wanted to create a strategy of prevention through deterrence, of making it, if people do get to the U.S. border, making it as difficult and hard to apply for the humanitarian protections that are affordable as possible. That's where you see border militarization, detention, but then also to make it as difficult as possible to get to the U.S. border in the first place, and to work with and to use its kind of power that it's gained through its kind of neo-colonial imperialist position to push other countries to help it keep people as far away from the border as possible. So you can really expect to continue to see that go forward. The Biden administration was kind of different in that it was externalizing lawful pathways as well. Some of the things that people have said, the programs mentioned about the safe mobility offices, the parole program for Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti, and Venezuela, it was externalizing lawful pathways, but it was also externalizing its border control as well. We have been to Panama a couple times over the last couple of years, because we were hearing a large amount of reports from women migrating through there, Haitian women, that there was huge amount of sexual and gender-based violence happening to them that was unaccounted for. No one was pursuing access to justice for it. So we have been down there visiting the region, talking with government officials, looking for access to justice for those victims. But in that process, we've also seen the creep of the U.S. continuing to use its partnerships to externalize its border militarization. So the Biden administration, and in a lot of ways, has actually created new structures that the Trump administration can pick up and really, turn up. And what I'll use there, for example, the U.S. and Panama entered into a first of its kind agreement under the Biden administration, where the U.S. actually agreed to fund deportation flights from Panama to other countries. So this is a first of its kind thing. And at the same time, Panama has had a new administration come in that, instead of allowing people to move through Panama, they are now attempting to close the border. Barbed wire, increased military presence, similar kind of thing you've seen develop in the US has been pushed down there. And with this, the Panamanian administration was actually complaining about how the Biden administration was not doing enough with this agreement. It had too many conditions on it. And what we expect is for this new administration to come in and take what's already been created and just ramp it up to attempt to close down the Darien Gap as a place for people to migrate, to have deportations directly happen from there versus from people getting to the U.S. border. And unfortunately, what we know happens when these strategies are employed is that the need for people moving doesn't stop because the root causes haven't changed. The smuggling networks that they claim to be targeting actually get better opportunities to find new paths that are harder to get through, and they can charge more. And so it actually helps those networks. But what it is doing is it's not having a large group of Black and brown people show up at the U.S. border exercising their rights. And unfortunately, the U.S. for a long time has been using border externalization to try and stop that. We just expect more of it. I will put Haitian Bridge Alliance and Coalition Partners analysis on border externalization in the chat. So thank you.
Thank you, and that's a good reminder. If others have resources that they would like to share, please also put them in the chat. I would like to expand a little bit more on the agreements and what Eric already mentioned a little bit of that, but I would like to discuss what type of agreements the Trump administration might pursue. Whether it's safe third country agreements, bilateral asylum programs, and how do we expect that neighboring countries will cooperate with this? And I would like to also expand a little bit more on bilateral removal agreements. How do we see the evolution of the ones that Eric just mentioned, given increased demands to the port, and talk a little bit about the responsibilities that there might be on the removing and receiving countries. I would like to pass it to Yael and Francisca.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I just wanted to emphasize something that Eric said, and when I ended my remarks before on regarding, the militarization, the use of the military in Mexico has become more prominent over the last few years, but it started long ago with U.S. pressuring the Mexican government really under the Obama administration. So this has been a kind of continual use of the military to keep people away from the U.S. border, and that we'll see continue. The Remain in Mexico program is one that the Trump administration has said it wants to implement again. This is partly because Mexico has made signing a safe third country agreement with the United States sort of a non-starter. So what an alternate that would mean that anybody who is in Mexico would sort of have to seek asylum there and wouldn't be able to come to the United States. Instead of that, Remain in Mexico program basically requires that people who want to be screened for asylum who come to the U.S. border would have to wait in Mexico for their hearings. And when this was underway during the first Trump administration, it was quite expensive and kind of cumbersome to put in place. The U.S. Supreme Court has given the U.S. executive branch the power to implement a Remain in Mexico program, but it's quite expensive. You kind of set up these 10 courts at the border. When it was in place during the first Trump administration, it created immense insecurity in the northern border cities along the lines that Eric was talking about. I mean, smugglers and cartels took advantage of all those people waiting in Mexico and northern cities. But the Trump administration seems committed to doing this again. It would require renegotiation with Mexico over what the program would look like. And I should just mention, there was litigation about this in Mexico, in Mexican courts. The Mexican court ruled that when Mexico receives asylum seekers from the U.S., Mexico has to guarantee the right to non-refoulement, so non-return to persecution to those folks because they were third country nationals, they weren't Mexicans, and also must publish guidelines about how their rights will be protected for housing and health and education. And there is ongoing litigation in Mexico regarding deportations of non-Mexicans to Mexico and how they need to be treated. The problem is, as some of you may know, is that there's been a lot of judicial reforms going on in Mexico. So the Mexican political context and the utility of using litigation to push back against a next Remain in Mexico program is unclear because there's turmoil in the courts in Mexico, and everything's sort of backed up. Other asylum agreements that I sort of see coming down the pike, is perhaps an asylum cooperative agreement. Folks may remember that during the first Trump administration, one such agreement was assigned, was sort of started with Guatemala. It started in late 2019 and was in place until around the time the COVID pandemic started. And it allowed the US to send anybody who came to the border to Guatemala, except for Guatemalans, to seek asylum in Guatemala instead of the United States. And unfortunately, the regulation that sort of also allowed this to happen is still on the books. The Biden administration never rescinded it. So I would predict perhaps in the early part of the Trump administration, an effort to build on, the good relations that the Trump administration has with Bukele, perhaps an asylum cooperative agreement with El Salvador. There are fewer Salvadorans coming to the U.S. border, so an agreement with El Salvador would allow the Trump administration to send non-Salvadorans to El Salvador to seek asylum there, or require that. Obviously, there could be litigation against that, pushing back on the idea that El Salvador is a safe third country. And one of the things that happened during the Biden administration, during the Trump administration, and continued during the Biden administration is that the Department of Homeland Security was given a lot of basically authority to really dictate how these bilateral agreements work. The State Department was not as present in these negotiations, and the Trump administration in Project 2025 has said that it wanted to continue along this lines, basically giving the Department of Homeland Security the ability to negotiate these kinds of agreements without having the State Department really there talking about other aspects of relations. And this is because migration control becomes such a huge part of what is demanded of other countries in the region. And so I could see El Salvador, in exchange potentially for security arrangements, private investment, other things, may agree early on to an asylum cooperative agreement like this. I just wanted to mention one other very important agreement that actually, to Eric's point, has, about tools that basically the Biden administration has prepared for use for, more use during the Trump administration. During the Biden administration, the Safe Third Country Agreement that the United States has with Canada was actually expanded. Now, what that means is that the US and Canada have an agreement whereby if a person enters through either country, they have to seek asylum in that country. So if you come to Canada, you seek asylum in Canada. If you try to cross southward to the United States, you'll be sent back to Canada to seek asylum there because Canada is a safe country. And the same going the other direction with the United States. If you come to the United States and you try to cross the northern border into Canada, you'll be sent back because Canada considers the United States a safe country. Now, it used to be that agreement, and during the first Trump administration, that agreement only applied to people who crossed at designated ports of entry. So last time Trump was elected, a lot of people tried to go to Canada between ports of entry and seek asylum that way because the Safe Third Country Agreement did not apply if you enter that way. Well, during the Biden administration, the agreement has been extended all across the border. So any way you enter Canada from the United States, for example, you will be sent back to the United States to seek asylum in the United States. There are exceptions to this if you have relatives in the United States, in Canada, sorry, let's say you're going northbound, Canada, seeking asylum there, or who have status in Canada. you can go to Canada. But this means that, you know, a sort of safety valve for people in the United States has been eliminated during the Biden administration. And right now, the US and Canadian governments really are screening people in both directions and sending them back, right, to each country, depending on which way they're going. You know, if with the unless you meet one of the exceptions. So I definitely think, for example, that we could see in the next Trump administration more people heading north between ports of entry to Canada, maybe trying to do so illegally, you know, unauthorized, going in very remote places across the border. To Eric's point about how restrictions on access to territory lead people to more dangerous routes. And the Safe Third Country Agreement doesn't apply to people if they're not detected within 14 days. So if they can stay underground in Canada for a little bit of time, they would actually be able to seek asylum in Canada. So I'm actually quite worried that what we're going to see is a lot of people trying to cross in remote parts of the border and stay underground in Canada, so that they're not sent back. And what I'm also, you know, Trudeau, you know, is under a lot of pressure in Canada to deal with the border, to be strict on immigration too. There's a conservative rise in Canada against immigration. So I don't see Canada really changing their policy or shifting on this agreement unless they're really forced to in the courts. And I will say one last thing about this is that during the previous Trump administration, there was litigation in Canadian courts to try to say that given the way that the US was detaining asylum seekers and given the way that eligibility for asylum, especially for women fleeing domestic violence or gender-based violence, was so restricted in the United States, the US should not be considered a safe country anymore under the Canadian Charter. And so I can see that possibility happening again, especially if the Trump administration drastically ramps up detention, family detention, drastically limits eligibility for asylum for people with real meritorious claims based on gender violence. And if the Trump administration, as it says it's promised to do, rolls back protection, for example, for unaccompanied children who have been exempt from the Safe Third Country Agreement all along. I could also see, for example, a lot of children trying to cross into Canada. They're exempt from the agreement. So these are things that could happen if protections disappear in the United States. We can see more people trying to get into Canada and potentially litigation in Canada to protect them. But again, as things stand now, they aren't very protected in Canada. So this is sort of a real live issue.
Thanks, Jael, for that detailed explanation. Francisca, would you like to add anything else on bilateral agreements? You're muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria Jose. I'd like to actually maybe discuss a little bit about removals and readmission agreements. As Eric mentioned, the Biden-Harris administration negotiated a bilateral agreement with the government of Panama to finance deportations or removal operations. And that was the first of its kind. So it has now set a precedent. And to kind of get a sense of what that might look like, I think it's important to look at what's happened over the past few months. So since about August, there have been about 20 commercial and charter flights. About 800 people have been deported from Panama. And so far, $1.2 million has been spent. This was considered a pilot program designed to be scaled up and implemented elsewhere. Note, for example, that there's actually a State Department and Department of Homeland Security team on the ground now in Costa Rica, exploring an agreement this week. So it's helpful to know that the bilateral agreement with Panama suffered some delays and hiccups. primarily because the Panamanians and the US couldn't see eye to eye on some critical protection safeguards to be built into that agreement. As Eric alluded to this, the agreement was held up from between about October 2023 and July of this year, July 2024. And a driving force behind that was US congressional interest. The House and the Senate were asking really key questions regarding protection safeguards, details of the operation, oversight, accountability, how the operation would be run. And I think with a view to ensuring that migrant screenings would uphold protection standards that are established under the 51 Refugee Convention and the 67 Protocol, as well as the Convention Against Torture. Now, as we know, in this election now, last week, the Senate flipped to the Republicans, and yesterday we all learned that Republicans won the House. So this effectively means that it's one united government, and there may be less resistance or less oversight to ensure some of the safeguards. The next Congress may not rigorously monitor the implementation of this or future agreements. Moreover, when we look at the number of people that have gone through or going through the Darien, the 800 people that have been removed, it's really just a drop of water in the bucket. Primarily because of the population most on the move through the Darien are Venezuelans, and Venezuelans are not subject to the agreement. The flights thus far have been to Colombia, to Ecuador, and one big flight to India. And there have been isolated cases of individuals removed to Afghanistan, Pakistan, Russia, Turkey. But there's no agreement between Panama and Venezuela to remove Venezuelans. Last month, however, a high-level official at the U.S. Embassy in Panama, the attaché of the Department of Homeland Security, did announce to the Panamanian press that the United States was in active discussions with other countries to receive Venezuelans deported directly from Panama. So I would expect that this would accelerate under the Trump administration. I think it's reasonable to expect as well that the Trump administration will eventually arrive at a removals agreement directly with the Venezuelan administration, given its repeated commitment to conduct mass deportations. And then finally, just note that these agreements right now have no safeguards that we know of with the receiving countries to properly receive, protect, and integrate anybody that is being removed from Panama, or that might be removed from Panama to another country.
Thanks, and that's a good segue because I wanted to touch a little bit on the future of humanitarian assistance and the assistance that the countries are getting. And with the Biden-Harris administration prioritizing humanitarian support for Venezuela and Central America through USAID and also through the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration at the State Department, how might assistance shift under a Trump administration? So, Francisca, if you could start with telling us a little bit about the overall panorama for humanitarian assistance, and then I would love for Rachel to touch on the potential cuts to Venezuelan specific aid.
Sure. So let's talk about the short term and longer term. Right now, the Senate bill has a State Department's main humanitarian account, the Migration and Refugee Assistance Account, MRA, at a decent level of funding. While the House side is reduced, we can't know what will happen, but I think I believe that the humanitarian community should be prepared for cuts. PRM right now, the Bureau for Population, Refugees, and Migration, they do have some funds to guard against some cuts in the short term. But longer term, we don't have a crystal ball, but we could look to the past and some of the proposals that have been already made to the Trump administration that might indicate the new direction that the administration will go in. In the first Trump administration, there was a big move to merge PRM, the State Department's humanitarian assistance arm, to merge PRM with the U.S. Agency for International Development. That didn't happen. But part of the motivation was actually to consolidate accounts and try to save money. And do note, you may have already seen, some of the people on the call, that the Trump administration already announced the establishment of a department or office of government efficiency that will be headed up by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy to, quote, cut wasteful expenditures and restructure federal agencies. And foreign assistance is always vulnerable in any cut or restructuring. They've also been quite vocal about foreign assistance cuts. Under the last administration, the humanitarian budget did actually increase, and funding for the Western Hemisphere did increase because of the Venezuela crisis. But what's different now, what's new, are all the calls to shift humanitarian funds towards border enforcement. If we look at recommendations that have been published, recommendations outlined to the Trump administration by Trump allies and former advisors, I think that it's a safe bet to assume that humanitarian assistance will shift border and securitization issues. Some of you may have heard of Project 2025, Mandate for Leadership. This is a comprehensive plan or a blueprint for a conservative federal government. And many of the contributors to that guide to Project 2025 did have high-ranking positions under the first Trump administration. The Project 2025 notes that PRM leads on international migration policy, and it administers almost $4 billion per year in humanitarian assistance. And a few quotes that I think is interesting that I could share with you. It states that the Biden administration has engineered what is nothing short of a collapse of US border security, that this administration's humanitarian crisis is arguably the greatest crisis in the modern era and will take many years and billions of dollars to address, and that PRM must shift its resources to challenges stemming from the current immigration situation until the crisis can be contained. It also suggests or recommends that the USAID administrator should be authorized to take on the additional role of Director of Foreign Assistance with the rank of Deputy Secretary of the Department of State in charge of all US foreign assistance. It recommends that the next administration, the Trump administration, resize and repurpose USAID's humanitarian aid portfolio. Recommends deep cuts in the IDA budget, USAID's budget. And another quote that I think it's important for us all to be aware of, it recommends a transition from large awards to expensive, inefficient and corrupt UN agencies, global NGOs, and contractors to local, especially faith-based entities that are already operating on the ground. So I think, if we read the tea leaves, this doesn't bode well for humanitarian assistance presently, as it's presently configured. And in any case, it will be important to emphasize at all times how U.S. government assistance helps provide safety and stability for populations. And specifically that, some of the PRM, for example, the PRM programs are far from USAID's wheelhouse, such as asylum system strengthening. And that's a very PRM specific and unique priority that aligns with some of the goals of the administration, which is people staying where they are.
Thanks, Francisca. Rachel, can you share in a couple of minutes some insights about the Venezuela specific aid?
Absolutely. So as Francisca already kind of mentioned, so under the previous Trump administration, the US did still continue to fund the Venezuela response. It didn't face sort of the same threats to funding as Northern Central American countries did, for example. So from 2017 to 2019, the US allocated over $400 million through USAID's Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, through the State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. And part of the reason this aid was maintained was because of the Trump administration's hostility towards the Maduro regime. And of course, there were Republicans like Marco Rubio who were pushing for aid, as well as very aggressive sanctions within Venezuela. So it could be that funding for the Venezuela response continues in some form, given that Marco Rubio is being tapped for Secretary of State and Trump's desire to keep migrants away from the US-Mexico border. However, several caveats. Much more Venezuelans are arriving to the United States than under the previous Trump administration. And additionally, people who are being tapped for the new administration have pretty vocal and open disdain for countries who have leftist-leaning presidents. So places like Mexico, Colombia, Chile. Some of them even say things like, quote, these regimes implement radical policies, are more open to striking partnerships with communist China, etc. And so there may be more reticence to provide funding to countries with more left-leaning leadership. And so this could bode really poorly for some Venezuelan hosting countries who really desperately need US support to continue funding programs for stabilization, for allowing people to remain in their host countries and access, work, healthcare, social services, etc. There's also this threat of cutting funding to several key agencies within the United Nations, like the World Food Program. And additionally, if Trump were to impose the same or similar sanctions again, that could worsen the humanitarian situation inside of Venezuela. It could impact out migration. And then, of course, of host countries like Colombia, who hosts, over 2 million Venezuelans currently, is not receiving critical support from the United States. We can probably expect more movement of Venezuelans northward. And additionally, if this funding is maintained, it's not going to look like it has been over the last 4 years. There will be significant restrictions. I think Francisca alluded to some, and I've mentioned a few already, but the Trump administration, for example, is going to rescind Biden's gender policy and refocus it on women, children, and families. So this is really going to narrow the definition for what constitutes a woman, for example. So it's going to leave out critical populations who have much higher vulnerabilities, like trans women. We can also expect little to no funding for any type of reproductive care, or funding for organizations who provide contraceptives, etc. So Venezuelans who have gone through the Darien that need access to this type of sexual and reproductive care are not going to get that type of funding from the United States, which is very concerning. And there will be a stronger emphasis on the private sector and private enterprises. So we may see some of the humanitarian funding being funneled to other types of private sector enterprises. So it could continue, but it will be limited, conditional, and probably afforded to those who align with the Trump administration's sort of new foreign policy agenda.
Thanks. I have a final question for Francisca before we pass it to Q&A. We have lots of questions. I mentioned this at the beginning, and we're talking about this regional approach that was put forward by the Biden administration with the LA Declaration on migration and protection. But it is clear that with the Trump administration, these efforts can be dismantled, including the LA Declaration and the framework that the LA Declaration brought forward. So how would this change affect long-term U.S. engagement in Latin America on migration? And what would be the fate of, cooperation with civil society, the recently selected technical secretariat for the LA Declaration? And how can this framework be strengthened? There is currently one leading country for the LA Declaration presiding over, which is Colombia. And so what are the roles that neighboring countries could play in advancing a response to migration in the region?
We take a cue from what the Trump administration did in the past with regards to collaboration on refugee and migration management. We know that Trump pulled the United States out of the Global Compact on Migration, stating that it was incompatible with U.S. sovereignty. Now, the LA Declaration is not binding. It's not a legal instrument. It's not a compact per se, so the U.S. can't technically withdraw, but the Trump administration could renounce it, decide not to continue collaborating with the rest of the countries through this mechanism. And the declaration is important because it has been the framework since 2022 for promoting collaboration on regional migration in the Americas. It's effectively the framework for migration governance right now in the region. Maria, you also mentioned a technical secretariat. That's an important milestone that was just achieved at the fourth ministerial meeting of the LA Declaration in September. The U.S. government announced a technical secretariat for the declaration, which is now co-chaired by the Organization of American States Department of Social Inclusion and the Pan American Development Foundation, an INGO. And their work is just getting underway, and the first country to step forward to serve as president for 1 year, president pro tempore, is Colombia. So this is good for the perennity of the Secretariat and the Declaration. Another country is leading at present. However, at present, it is the U.S. who has funded the establishment of the Technical Secretariat that will coordinate the work across the 22 countries. And that commitment is just for 1 year at present. While it was thought that the commitment might continue for 3 years, I think that the following 2 years would now be in question under a different U.S. administration. So other countries will likely need to step up to the plate to support. I think that during the last Trump administration, we saw a lot of international cooperation in the Americas, such as through the Quito process or at regional levels, like the Southern Conference on Migration or the Central American one, the CRM. So
I'm not terribly concerned in that sense. Cooperation will move forward, but it certainly would be a great shame if the United States weren't an active partner at that table, and have clear eyes on how its policies might impact migratory movements throughout the region.
Thank you, Francisca. I'm going to start with a couple of pre-submitted questions. We have lots of questions in the chat that I know the panelists are trying to answer. Hannah, I have 2 questions for you. First, will agreed upon resettlement numbers to resettlement agencies be subject to change for fiscal year 2025? And then we have one submitted on SMOs. Could some of the speakers elaborate on the impacts related to the Safe Mobility offices? We've heard that PRM is currently reviewing future scenarios, including the potential closure of this program in Guatemala, Colombia, Ecuador, and Costa Rica.
Sure. With respect to the first question, I don't work for a resettlement agency, so it's possible that others know more. But what I can say is 2 things. One, the presidential determination on refugee admissions provides the maximum of refugees that can be resettled from a particular region, and the State Department coordinates with domestic resettlement agencies to plan out how many arrivals they should expect for a fiscal year. I do not believe that to be binding or any type of leverage to require a future administration to admit people as refugees who they do not wish to or intend to admit. Under the first Trump administration, within weeks of taking office, the president drastically cut the refugee admissions cap from what Obama had set of 110,000 to 50,000. And then each subsequent fiscal year under the first Trump administration, that cap was further reduced to ultimately 15,000. But those are, again, the caps. And so the numbers of people who actually were resettled each of those years was far less than those caps. The second piece about the resettlement agencies is that the way that their funding works is resettlement agencies are reimbursed following the actual resettlement. And so if people don't arrive, the money also doesn't arrive for the work that resettlement agencies had already previously carried out. There's a separate question as to whether resettlement agencies have diversified their funding sources so that it is not so exclusively State Department funding, so that hopefully resettlement agencies are not laying people off in the same way that had to happen under the first administration, the first Trump administration. As to the second question on the safe mobility offices, these are wholly discretionary executive branch initiatives, programs. And so there would be quite limited obstacles for the Trump administration to dismantle those offices. I think I alluded earlier to the question of what happens to people who are presently in process in the pipeline. And it depends how the Trump administration goes about terminating refugee processing, including terminating the Safe Mobility Initiative. How they go about it informs what legal challenges may or may not exist. What I can share from IRAP brought litigation under the first Trump administration to challenge the termination of different refugee processing under the Central American Minors Program. And in that context, it was only individuals who had reached a very advanced stage of processing who were ultimately protected by a settlement agreement. So it's hard to say, but certainly the hundreds of thousands of people who are in earlier stages of the process are unlikely to have much legal protection.
Thanks, Hannah. We have another pre-submitted question that I'm going to pass to Eric, please. To what extent there are substantive policy difference between the Republican and Democratic parties regarding carceral elements of the U.S. and of U.S.-led regional border and migration strategies?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Maria Jose, and whoever pre-submitted it. In the grand scheme of things, I wouldn't say there's a large substantive difference between Republicans and Democrats. I think there's a U.S. consensus around the use of incarceration as a management strategy that is different than the rest of the world. I actually worked in domestic Ohio prisons doing human rights litigation and monitoring before working in the international space. And, you know, the US has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of its people in jail or prison. So that's domestically, but the domestic system grew in tandem with the immigration carceral system. And we, you know, have under numerous administrations, Republican or Democrat, continue to expand that system. We incarcerate, you know, around over 30,000 people at any given day or time in immigration detention, even though it's only supposed to be a civil and not a criminal matter. So in the grand scheme of things, the incarceral sort of ethos of the US in order to manage so-called undesirable people will continue. However, what I will say is that the actual practices and the brutality that exists within the detention will likely get worse. The Biden administration, the Democrats have a human rights framework. They have, you know, when they came in, they limited family detention. We saw under the Trump administration, the intentional child separation practices. Again, it goes back to that idea of we want to make this as brutal and difficult and terrible of experience as possible so that other people won't come. That's the idea. And unfortunately, we don't know exactly what the new strategies will look like, but we expect them to continue to make it very hard. And when you have an administration whose Department of Justice, whose all the you know, the oversight mechanisms may not be used as much, and there's a, you know, you have a candidate who openly said, I want an hour when all law enforcement just goes crazy on the so-called bad people. there's a culture and environment that makes it even more rampant and open for abuse when people are incarcerated.
Thanks, Eric. We have lots of questions about TPS, so I'm going to try and pack them, and whomever wants to go. If the Biden administration were to redesignate various countries, would there be enough time for processing before the Trump administration comes in? If not, how might that affect the real access to the program in spite of eligibility? What are the chances that the Biden administration pass new TPS designations for Colombia, Ecuador, Guatemala, and Congo? What is preventing the Biden administration from redesignating TPS for these countries during the lame duck session? Would the Trump administration be able to end TPS and associated work authorization prior to expiration, for example, before April of next year? Who wants to go?
I'll take what I can answer, and then maybe Hannah or others who feel comfortable answering what they can answer on this. Uh, Technically, there's nothing stopping the Biden administration from designating a country. The way TPS designations work is that it's usually a multi-agency process determining the conditions that exist in certain countries. Sometimes the State Department weighs in, but DHS ultimately makes the decision about whether or not to designate a country for TPS. I think the question about if, for example, there's a lot of political pressure put on the Biden administration to make a lot of designations. Like everybody contacted the Biden administration, really put a lot of political pressure on the Biden administration to do this. The question about whether or not USCIS, which is the part of the Department of Homeland Security that would be processing all the applications for TPS, would actually be able to do that quickly is a very good question. USCIS is a fee-funded agency that doesn't have a lot of resources, that are already pretty maxed out. There are already a lot of delays in applications. So yes, there's long backlogs for TPS. I think for Haiti alone, it's about a year to get your TPS application approved. So this is a real problem. Resources would have to come from somewhere. So there would have to be somebody at the Secretary of DHS, there would have to be resources allocated to USAS specifically to do this, to process all these applications. And it's a valid concern that given the short timeline, it would be it wouldn't be possible to process, millions of TPS applications or hundreds of thousands of TPS and associated work authorization applications. There are ways to streamline them, to sort of do the work authorization and TPS applications together. There have been one of the innovative things USCIS did when a lot of folks from Venezuela, had come in through the border to different cities and then were staying in shelters in different cities of the United States, and TPS was designated for Venezuela. There was efforts by USCIS to go do sort of clinics on the ground to try to quickly approve applications for TPS and work authorization like on site. But again, those are quite resource intensive, right? You need resources that the funding hasn't been appropriated by Congress to do those kinds of things. So that would be a scramble to sort of get a lot of these applications approved quickly.
Anyone else on TPS? We have questions on Welcome Corps. What is the expectations for programs like Welcome Corps and current humanitarian parole programs, plus any recommendation about current under construction programs to help people reunite with their families in the US, to be done through this current administration with minimal publication? Can the Welcome Corps program be curtailed by an executive order? And if, as you touch on these questions, if you want to share anything else on Welcome Corps, please do.
I'm happy to start. So Welcome Corps is also, it's a form of private sponsorship to access refugee resettlement by private individuals in the United States agreeing to sponsor either a refugee whom they know or somebody whom they don't know. And there are many, many people in the United States who have formed these sponsorship groups, and many refugees around the world, not just in Latin America and the Caribbean, who are in a process hoping to be resettled to the United States, where if they arrive as refugees, that private sponsorship group would be receiving them, welcoming them. Just, of course, those who asked these questions know that, but for everyone to understand. As a form of refugee resettlement, it has the same weakness against Trump administration assaults as other aspects of refugee resettlement that we've talked about, similar to the Safe Mobility Initiative. There is no statutory, legislative, congressional protection for Welcome Corps that does exist for certain aspects of refugee processing, not pertaining to Latin America and the Caribbean. So we don't know. I don't know what will happen to private sponsorship specifically. I think it has had more bipartisan support than other dimensions of refugee resettlement, but I don't think I can predict what will happen specifically with Welcome Corps. And for people who are in that pipeline, same comment as before, that depending on where one is in processing at the time a case is terminated or a program is terminated, is likely very consequential for what legal remedy there may be. In terms of the question around other humanitarian parole programs, I don't know if we mentioned earlier the family reunification parole programs for Cubans, Haitians, Salvadorans, Hondurans, Guatemalans, Colombians, and Ecuadorians. 7 nationalities have access to this program where if you have an approved family-based petition, but no visa number available, you can be paroled into the United States to be with your family for the years that it may take to have a green card. And as of August 2024, about 60,000 families benefited from this program, or that's how many individuals were paroled into the United States. Again, the categorical statements about curtailing the parole authority does not bode well for those programs continuing or for people with parole status in the United States maintaining that status.
Thanks, Hannah. Thank you. It's all very uncertain, so having some ideas as we move forward, it's really helpful. There is a question about expectations for the impact of this administration on unaccompanied children, both those in ORR custody and also unaccompanied children released to sponsors in the US. And just to flag, we have 5 more minutes, so if we can respond in 2 minutes so we can get to a final question, that would be great. Thank you.
I'm happy to speak to this, but somebody else wanted. So the expectation is that the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is part of Health and Human Services, will be moved to the Department of Homeland Security, and the statutory protections for unaccompanied children, having access to counsel, legal standards, social services, to repeal that law. Many of you may have heard of the Flores Settlement Agreement that establishes standards for children in immigration custody and families. The plan is for the Trump administration to eliminate that. So it is bleak with respect to unaccompanied children, both from an institutional perspective and from a legal perspective. I'll leave it there for time.
Just wanted to add one thing. I agree with that 100%. I think the one thing is it would, especially with the Trafficking Victim Protections Act, which is the law that ensures that when unaccompanied children from non-contiguous countries, so except with the exception of Mexico for coming to the southern border, those children that are placed in ORR custody and not repatriated, that is the law. So although both houses of Congress are likely to be Republican, in order to make that change, to get rid of that, the way the U.S. currently handles unaccompanied children coming to the border from third countries, that would still require kind of a change in legislation, most probably. So that probably wouldn't happen right away. The situation is bleak, like it could change, right? But some of the unlike some of the things related to refugee resettlement that Hannah talked about, there is some congressional meat on the bones here for protections for children. And I do want to just emphasize that some of them will require much more than the executive branch saying, like, we don't want to do this anymore. It will require some significant legislative change.
Thank you. I have a final question, maybe for Rachel. What can individuals and congregations do, and how can organizations in the US and Latin America collaborate to face what's being presented here today?
It's a great question. And I think as we brace for the next 4 years, mutual support between like-minded organizations is going to be key in pushing against some of the policies that might be coming down the pike. And so I think just continuing to have open lines of communication between organizations here in the United States as well as throughout the region. We really rely on diaspora organizations, on people who are working on both sides of the border throughout the region. And as migration has changed and become much more regional and more populations are coming to the United States, I think it's important for us to diversify our connections and look beyond just our own in-groups. So let's just continue to collaborate on issues that affect migrants across the hemisphere.
Thank you so much for joining us today for this critical discussion. As we heard from this panel, the next phase of advocacy to shape migration frameworks that really prioritize safe and dignified pathways for all will not be easy. It really brings me hope to engage with these creative, equipped, engaged individuals and organizations as we face this uncertain future. I think your engagement in today's conversation, as we talk about how can we collaborate, is a vital part of this ongoing effort to really implement a comprehensive, inclusive regional migration management system. So thank you to our panelists, our moderators, and the interpreters and everyone who's joined today. I encourage you to follow all of the organizations on the call today, sign up for their newsletter, stay engaged so we can continue to advance these essential goals together. Thank you so much to all.